Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our lecture 16. If you recall, we have had 15 lectures so far. And if you recall, in lecture 1 and lecture 2, we did discuss issues of knowledge, the nature of understanding, and the knowledge and reality out there. Now, when we come to lecture 15 and lecture 14 and lecture 13, we are concerned with modeling. We actually looked at economic modeling. And the kind of modeling we are concerned with were of two types. One, we did discuss the mathematical modeling, and the second one was econometrics, which is actually statistical modeling. And we did see that among the economists, we have certain individuals who have taken up that perspective of mathematical modeling, while others have taken up the perspective of econometrics. But whatever model and the perspective that these people have taken, the major objective is to try and get a model that represents the reality out there. We saw how difficult it is for economists to come up with models that certainly approximate to the reality out there. And that's why we did discuss issues of idealization, if you recall, issues of de-idealization, and then the idealization and the de-idealization debate. I hope by this time you now know exactly what is important at that material time and what we consider in those modelings or models that we develop in the area of economics. So today, I want to take you to aspects of truth, which is one of the central problems of philosophy, because in modeling, we come up with a model that approximates reality, a model that is representative of what is out there. Of course, we saw the challenges of doing that, but that doesn't prevent us really from going back into issues of truth. So in this lecture, I want to tie up the loose ends and be able to integrate our lecture 1, lecture 2, lecture 13, 14, and 15. And most of these things will be presented in this lecture 16. So as you can see, today I will be covering knowledge, truth, and justification. And we know that this is really one of the major aspects of really philosophy of science. So I want our discussion to center, especially as we move towards the end, our discussion will center around truth, which is one of the central problem of philosophy. So in this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you an introduction. Then from the introduction, I'll go to the three senses of known, or what we call three senses of knows. And then we shall go to propositional knowledge and justified true beliefs, and then thereafter we shall go into beliefs, we shall go into truth, and then eventually look at epistemic justification, ladies and gentlemen. Now, as you can see, and as I said earlier on, epistemology, which you can also consider to be the theory of knowledge, is concerned with a variety of questions about knowledge and the related topics in philosophy. And as you are aware by now, this is one of the most important areas that philosophy attempts to address. And certainly, as you can see, the most important question that philosophy attempts to answer is the issue of knowledge. So what is the extent of our knowledge? And in fact, when you see people trying to do some bit of modeling or undertaking studies, doing research in one way or the other, they are trying to understand reality out there. So as you see, some philosophers, when they attempt to answer this central question of knowledge, the extent of our knowledge, especially those who come from the common sense perspective or tradition, they would say that we know pretty much those things that we ordinarily think that we know. So there is that element, people thinking that we know much, and more specifically, possibly knowing the things that we already know. And there are those philosophers who use that bit of common sense, and they really do think, and actually we call them common sense philosophers, because they will, when you say or when you tell them that I know this, they will say, yes, you know it, because certainly you think that you know, and maybe for quite some time you had that kind of thinking or perspective in your mind. So in other words, those philosophers would tell us, for example, that we know there are other people. Of course, that is a perspective. And of course, they would also say that, yes, those people that do exist, they also have an element of thinking, and they also have some bit of feelings. I mean, such questions. And they will also say, well, you know, you can say, yes, we were alive yesterday, and certainly maybe that is a common sense that yesterday you were around, and that's why you are around today. So, and many other things may come up, that, you know, there are dogs, there are cars, we have trees, we have all these sorts of things. And certainly that still goes to the issue of knowledge, as you can see. And they would also tell us, ladies and gentlemen, that we know a lot about our immediate physical environment and surroundings, other people, and some of the things that we have experienced in the past. Now, of course, some other philosophers would add that we know various ethical and moral truths, and some would also say that they know various truths about God and God's attitude towards mankind. While some other philosophers who are influenced by various forms of skepticism would say that we know much less than any of this. And they also say, well, possibly most of the things that you are really talking about that do exist, they don't exist at all. In fact, they will even make you question some of the things that you thought were in existence. So those are the most skeptical philosophers. So they say we know less about reality, we know less about these things that do exist, and while others who are extreme would say we know nothing. And of course, as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, evaluating these views is not really an easy thing, as you can see. And that's why we've been going through all these lectures, especially when we sit down and we start reflecting on them, and also start looking at reasons advanced in favor of these things. So it's not so easy for you to make judgment at the end of the day. So you also start questioning certain things that you thought you knew very well. Now, such a reflection, ladies and gentlemen, might naturally lead us to ask one of the most important and oldest epistemological questions, and that's the question of knowledge. What is knowledge? Now, of course, over 2 millennia ago, Plato wrestled with this very question in his dialogue, Theaetetus. I hope you've had an opportunity to read that dialogue. Now, Plato sought a definition of knowledge, but came to no clear answer, and the dialogue ended inconclusively. So he attempted to look for the definition of knowledge, and of course, as you can see, he did not really come up to any conclusion. So the primary aim of this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, is to introduce the traditional account of propositional knowledge as a epistemically justified true belief. And after that, I shall make some general remarks about the main components of the traditional account of the propositional knowledge. So we'll be looking at issues of truth, we shall be looking at issues of belief, and certainly epistemic justification. And in most cases, most of the people who give the definition of knowledge, they will tell you that knowledge is justified through beliefs. And actually, my lecture, this lecture 16 and 17 and 18, will center around those three aspects and try to, again, bring those things back home in the area of economics. So as you can see, these three things that I've just given you are very important, and I would call them the three senses of know. Right, and when I talk about know here, it is K-N-O-W. So these are the three senses of know. Now, as you can see in ordinary language, when we say that someone knows something, we can mean different things by knows, right? So when you say this one knows, right, this aspect, this one has information about this. Now, of course, at the end of the day, you will see that there will probably, you can have many interpretations of that. So when we talk about those three aspects that make up the definition of knowledge, beliefs, truth, and epistemic justification, these are very important, and they actually give us the sense of know. So in ordinary language, when we say that someone knows something, as I've already said, we can mean different things by knows. And there are different senses of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, or we may say different kinds of knowledge in this case. So among the three most significant are what you call the propositional knowledge, what we call the acquaintance knowledge, and what we call the how-to knowledge. And when I say how-to, I know I'm going to expound on this, but I really mean you having the knowledge to do something. If I'm able to sing, that is the how-to knowledge. If I'm able to dance, that is the how-to knowledge. If I'm able to make a table, that is the how-to knowledge. So when we talk about knowledge, I know we can refer to different kinds of knowledge, and we need to understand this knowledge very well. So that's why the three senses of knowledge, we take the three most significant ones, and that's propositional knowledge, that is acquaintance knowledge, and that is the how-to knowledge. So let us begin with the propositional knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. Now, propositional knowledge is knowledge of facts or true propositions. So when we talk about propositional knowledge, we are actually referring to facts, right? That is knowledge of facts or knowledge of true propositions. So I'll give you an example, ladies and gentlemen, for us to understand this kind of thing. So example number one, we might say that John knows that Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. Of course, you know Mugabe was a president of Zimbabwe. So, but you can say, John knows that Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. That is example number one we are going to use. And I'll also give you a second example. John knows that the sky is blue, ladies and gentlemen. So those are two issues in this case that we need to examine in detail. Now, in these examples, the objects of knowledge, or what is known, are respectively the true propositions that, one, Mugabe was deposed in a military coup, and two, the sky is blue. It is important to distinguish between sentences and propositions, ladies and gentlemen. If we can't make a difference between sentences and propositions, then we'll never understand knowledge very well. So I've given you an example. If you recall, Mugabe was deposed in a military coup, and the sky is blue in this case. So in that aspect, we see what is known, right? And you have those two propositions. And that's why we are talking about propositional knowledge. Propositional knowledge refers to facts, remember? So once we start articulating these things, we say Mugabe was deposed, right, in a military coup, and possibly this happened. But you can also say the sky is blue. So when you go out, you can actually look up there, out there, and you see that element of blue out there. So it is important, ladies and gentlemen, for us to understand what propositions are. But again, propositions are not the same as sentences, although sentences, again, propositions are constructed in form of sentences. So it's important to distinguish between sentences and propositions. Now, let me just give you another example, ladies and gentlemen. Consider two people, Paul and Pierre. Let's imagine that Paul and Pierre are two other individuals that we know. Now, let's suppose that each believes that the sky is blue, right? So Paul believes that the sky is blue, and also Pierre believes that the sky is blue. But because these two people come from different cultures and environments, and they also speak different languages, so Paul will speak in English and say the sky is blue. But let's imagine that Pierre comes from France. Pierre will certainly say that le ciel est bleu, right? So le ciel est bleu is a statement made by Pierre, while Paul says that the sky is blue. So that is how these two people express their beliefs. So Paul expresses his belief that the sky is blue, while Pierre expresses his belief that le ciel est bleu. Now, though each expresses his belief by a different sentence, ladies and gentlemen, each believes the same proposition. So Pierre believes the same proposition, that the sky is blue, although he uses different words to express that. But we also know Paul believes the same thing. So when we are constructing knowledge, this becomes very important because there is propositional knowledge, and we need to understand propositional knowledge very well. We are going to work with the propositions most of the time. So if we don't know what propositions are, then we'll never state one, right? So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, since these two people that I've just given you, each knows that the sky is blue, each knows the same proposition. So we may think of belief as a relation between a subject and a proposition. So we can see this is a belief that they have, the sky is blue, right? But being expressed in the form of a proposition. And we can see here that that belief, right, that these two people hold is also the same, by the way, is really a relation between a subject that they are discussing and certainly the proposition that they are putting forward. Now, if the proposition one believes is true, ladies and gentlemen, then one's belief is also true. And if the proposition one believes is false, then one's belief is also false. Remember, when we define knowledge as justified true beliefs. So the issue of belief is part of the definition. The other issue is true. The issue of true is part of it. And the other one is that of justification. But we haven't reached justification yet. We are now discussing issues that relate to knowledge, and we are dealing with the proposition knowledge. But in this case, we are actually talking about knowledge that is true. So the issue of belief becomes very important. So we also know, we may, ladies and gentlemen, think of propositional knowledge, as a relation between a subject and a proposition. I've already given you that, if you recall. But more precisely, propositional knowledge is a relation between a subject, and never forget this, between a subject and a true proposition. True proposition. So a proposition is supposed to be true, not false, right? So you can't build knowledge on false beliefs, right, and false propositions. So that's why we must take care and take time in developing propositions. So if you're going to do research, right, and you're going to come up with, for instance, you're going to use a research question or research questions, and use also propositions, and use hypothesis, right? We don't expect you to use the information that is available or your experience to propose something that doesn't really make sense. So proposition knowledge is very important and is not the only sort of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So do not forget that. Although proposition knowledge exists, as we have seen, it is not the only sort of knowledge. We also have other types of knowledge, as we shall see. I'm going to give you a second example. Suppose, for example, that someone makes the following claim, and or probably claims. And this will be now the third. Remember, the first one, the second one was about the sky is blue. But let's now, and of course Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. But let's take the third one here now. Suppose, for example, someone made the following claims that John knows the president of Uganda. And he also make a fourth claim that John knows the Pope. Remember, the first proposition, right? The first claim that was made, and the second one about Mugabe, and of course about Paul, if you recall, and Pierre, were very important for us to understand proposition knowledge. But now we are advancing another perspective. John knows the president of Uganda, and John knows the Pope, ladies and gentlemen. So we might naturally take these claims to imply that John is acquainted with the president of Uganda and that he's acquainted with the Pope. When you say he knows, John knows the Pope, John knows the president. So now you bring in an element of acquaintance. So you may actually think that the claim that John has made actually means that he's acquainted with the Pope and that he's also acquainted with the president of Uganda. So we might naturally take claim 3 and claim 4 to imply that John has met the president of Uganda and that John has met the Pope, ladies and gentlemen. So if we take 3 and 4 in that perspective, then that element comes in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that brings in another type of knowledge that we shall call acquaintance knowledge, right? Remember, the first one was propositional knowledge. Now this is acquaintance knowledge. So to say that John has acquaintance knowledge of someone is to imply that he's acquainted with him or that he has met him. And acquaintance knowledge in this case needs to be distinguished from propositional knowledge. Remember, propositional knowledge relates to facts, right? When we talk about propositional knowledge, we are talking about facts. Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. That is a fact. When I tell you, come and see, the sky is blue, that is a fact. And therefore, that is propositional knowledge. I'm actually assuming here that you are not colorblind, because if you are colorblind, you may not be able to tell whether the color is blue or red or something like that. But if you don't have any defect of that sort, then what you are talking about is actually a fact. So, in the first case, we looked at propositional knowledge, and of course now we talk about acquaintance knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. Right? Once somebody says, I know, that element of acquaintance may come in, ladies and gentlemen. So, obviously, as you can see, one can have a great deal of propositional knowledge, and someone, well, you have a great deal of propositional knowledge about an individual, right, without necessarily having acquaintance knowledge. And that's what brings the two knows, right, or knowledge different in this perspective. So, I might, for example, have a great deal of propositional knowledge about the president. I can have, right, that knowledge about him, but I may not have met him. Let me say this. Let's say I know that the president was born on such and such a day, and I also tell you that he attended such and such a school, and for his primary, for his secondary, He also went to the university and he did a bachelor's degree, probably in political science, University of Dar es Salaam, right? And then continue and give you this kind of information. Yes, what I'm giving you are probably facts about the president, right? But that kind of knowledge is propositional knowledge, but not acquaintance knowledge. I have not met him, right? But when somebody says, I know the president, you may actually assume that he's talking about acquaintance knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what it is. So that's why I'm saying that even though I might have a great deal of proposition knowledge about the president, it will not follow that I have acquaintance knowledge with the president, ladies and gentlemen, since I'm not acquainted with him and have not met him and we have not even talked, ladies and gentlemen. So in ordinary language, when we say A knows B, we are sometimes using know, the word know, K-N-O-W, in the propositional sense, and sometimes in the acquaintance sense. So that's why we have acquaintance knowledge and proposition knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So let me just give you another example. Suppose an intelligence officer says, grimly, I know this killer, and he will strike again and soon, right? So our intelligence officer need not be taken to mean that he has actually met the killer or that he's acquainted with him, right? But he might simply, he might simply mean that he knows the killer is the sort that will soon strike again. So that's why we need to be very, very careful and try to understand what kind of knowledge we are talking about. So he has a certain sort of proposition knowledge about the killer. And similarly, if I'm impressed with John's vast knowledge about the president, I might say, John really knows the president. Clearly, I'm implying that John has a lot of proposition knowledge about the president, and not that John has met him. So one can have acquaintance knowledge of things other than people, and one can have, for example, acquaintance knowledge of any other thing that you may choose to take as an example. Okay, let's take an example of Nairobi, right? Somebody might say, well, I have acquaintance knowledge of Nairobi, or probably a taste of a mango, or probably banana, something like that. Now, if one has such knowledge of Nairobi, then one has been there. And if one has knowledge of the taste of a mango, then one has tasted a mango in this case. So again, we need to distinguish knowledge of this sort from proposition knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So one might have much in the way of proposition knowledge about Nairobi, knowing where the city is, knowing where the main avenues are, the main streets are, and the person also knows the various landmarks in Nairobi, but he may have all that knowledge without the sort of acquaintance knowledge that implies actually he has been there in this case. So in addition to proposition knowledge and acquaintance knowledge, ladies and gentlemen, let us consider the third knowledge that I did talk about. That is the how-to knowledge. So sometimes when we say A knows how to X, remember how to, you can put that in brackets, the how to, right. So sometimes when we say A knows how to X, we mean or imply that A has the ability to X. In other cases, as you can see, when we say that A knows how to X, we do not mean or imply that A has the ability to X in this case, right? And I hope you note the difference, the how to, right? A knows how to X, right? So he knows how to do it. He knows how to perform a task. In this case, we do not imply that A has the ability to X, because ability now is totally different and not in the same line with the how-to that we mean in this case. So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. So one sense of knowing how to X, which implies that one has the ability to X and another sense that doesn't. So those are the two aspects that come in here. So, but let's just give an example again to clarify this. And we shall take this as example 5. I hope you are noting these, because later on I'll be referring to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You remember the first one was Mugabe was deposed in a military coup. Right, I hope you remember that. And the second one was about the sky. The sky is blue, right? And I hope you haven't forgotten that perspective. So when we come to 5 here, right, let's just give an example. Let's assume we have a claim. Wabukala knows how to play a piano sonata, right? That is now claim number 5. And claim number 6, Wabukala has the ability to play a piano. Remember, claim 5 is Wabukala knows how to play a piano. Now, 6, Wabukala has the ability to play a piano. I hope you see the difference between these two. 1, he knows how to play, right? And 6, he has the ability. So traditionally, philosophers have been most concerned with the propositional knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. And one reason for this is that philosophers are typically concerned with what is true. So they are concerned with the facts. So we don't go into these. He has the ability to, because we don't know the extent to which you can actually execute a particular task. So you may have the ability, but you may not be able to really undertake that particular activity. So philosophers want to know what is true, and they want to evaluate and assess their own claims and those of others so that they get the truth. Now, when the philosophers ask questions about the extent of our knowledge, they are typically concerned with the extent of our propositional knowledge, and that is the concern, with the extent of the truth that we know. So our search for knowledge takes us into this direction of propositional knowledge, right? And that's why we need to make and develop valid propositions, ladies and gentlemen. So when one philosopher says he knows that there are external objects, and another philosopher denies this, they are disagreeing about whether there is propositional knowledge of a certain sort. So they are concerned with propositional knowledge, and their disagreements will always be around propositional knowledge. So they are disagreeing about whether truth of a certain kind are known. So acquaintance knowledge and how-to knowledge are not in the same way truth-focused, ladies and gentlemen. So let us consider the concept of propositional knowledge more closely. So in the next few minutes, I want to take you through what we call propositional knowledge and justified true belief, because the definition of knowledge is in terms of justified true beliefs. These 3 notions, one, justification, the other one is true, and the third one is belief, ladies and gentlemen. So propositional knowledge and justified true beliefs are important aspects for us to consider. Now, we noted at the beginning of this lecture, ladies and gentlemen, that the question, what is knowledge, is an ancient question, and it has been puzzling philosophers, including the philosophers of this time. Since our focus, ladies and gentlemen, is on propositional knowledge, we might ask, what is it for someone to have propositional knowledge? Alternatively, we might ask, what is it for a subject S to know that P, right? And when we say that, what is it for a subject S to know that P, where P is some proposition? Well, the question we are more or less talking about here is similar to the issue that I raised earlier on, right? And we're talking about propositional knowledge in this case, propositions. So somebody tells you that, Mugabe was deposed, right? Or the third issue, if you recall the third one and the fourth, the third was about having knowledge about the president. When John says, I know the president of Uganda. So when he talks about, I know the president of Uganda, so we start now interrogating that, right? Yes, that might be a fact, that is true. But we want to understand the extent to which this information is correct. So you can see that we need to understand what is in there, right? What someone is saying that makes that kind of statement proposition knowledge. So that's why we ask that question, right? What is it for a subject S to know that P, right? And when we say that P is some proposition, right? So what is there? And that can be proposition knowledge. It could also be acquaintance knowledge. But here we are concerned with proposition knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So let us consider the concept of proposition knowledge more closely. And we shall take some few minutes discussing this. According to one traditional view, to have proposition knowledge that P is, so for you to have proposition knowledge that P is to have epistemically justified true belief that P, right? So for you to have knowledge about that proposition, right, that means you have epistemic justifications. And these are now knowledge justifications. You must justify. So now there must be evidence to prove beyond reasonable doubt that what you are saying is correct. And of course that is not very easy, but that's what it is. To have proposition knowledge that P is to have epistemically justified true belief that P, and P is the proposition. So before we consider this traditional view, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin by considering the following clearly mistaken view. We know that some people have mistaken views. So let's, again, I'll use symbols in this case, and I'm sure you can see these symbols on the screen here. D1, right, and we say D1 on the extreme right-hand side, sorry, left-hand side, and then of course we've got some space there, and then you say S knows that P is equal to DF. So again, the implication of this that S believes that P, right? So we bring in the issue of belief of the proposition. So of course here you can see according to D1, right? Believing something is sufficient for knowing it. And that's what you see on the screen here means. D1, right? S knows that P is equal to DF. S believes that P, and P is a proposition, ladies and gentlemen. Right, so you can see if D1 were true, then someone who believed a false proposition would know it. Let me just give you an example, right? Again, now I want to use a live example to describe the D1. S knows that P is equal to DF, where S believes that proposition. Right, so let's take an example. If a child believes that 2 plus 3 is equal to 6, right? I hope you are getting me. If a child, for example, believes that 2 plus 3 is equal to 6, then according to D1, the child would know that 2 plus 3 is equal to 6. But the child does not know that. So D1 is false. So the moment you start writing propositions, right, and then you bring the issue of belief, right? So that's why we say according to D1, believing something is sufficient for knowing it, right? And therefore, your belief must have that element of justification, don't forget that. If D1, right, were true, then someone who believed a false proposition would know it. You would know that this is false and this is right. So the issue of truth becomes important. So D1 in our case, a child believes 2 plus 3 is equal to 6. Then D1, certainly the child would know that 2 plus 3 is equal to 6. Unfortunately, the child doesn't know that the right figure is probably 5. So the child doesn't know that, so D1 is certainly false. Now, admittedly, ladies and gentlemen, people do sometimes say that they know things, right, that are false. I hope you get what I'm saying here. Like in this case of a child saying 2 plus 3 is equal to 6, and that's the belief the child has. But unfortunately, the answer is actually 5. So D1 in this case is false. And so in the same way, people do sometimes say that they know things, right? Now, what they think they actually know, unfortunately, is wrong, is false in this case. So, for example, let me just give you another example. A football fan might be utterly convinced that his team will win the championship, for those who enjoy football. Now, after his team loses, he might say, I just knew they would win. Right? I hope you are following. A football fan, right, might be utterly convinced that his team will win the championship. Now, after the football match and after the team losing, then you find the same football fan, right, saying, I just knew they would win, right? Too bad they didn't. But our fan did not know that his team would actually win. He was simply confident or convinced that they would. So his claim to know is perhaps best understood as a bit of hyperbole, as when one says, I am just dying of hunger, or I would just kill for a cigarette. Such claims are usually not to be taken literally. Strictly speaking, what our fan says is false in this case. And that's why when somebody says, I'm just dying of hunger, you need to really understand exactly what the fellow is saying. So that's why we're saying that our football fan is certainly false. So mere belief then is not sufficient for knowledge. Although we say knowledge is justified through belief, yes, there must be an element of justification. Mere belief does not actually constitute knowledge in this case, ladies and gentlemen. So knowledge requires that one's belief be true. So I can give you another example. So let us consider the following. I'm sure you can now see this on the screen as well. D2 now. The other one was D1. D2. Right, D2, S knows that P is equal to DF. Right. Now, if that is the case, S believes that P, and where P is a proposition, right? And that proposition is that P is equal to DF in this case. S believes that P, right, and P is true, right? So that's what we're talking about, justified true beliefs, right? Now, D2 tells us that one knows that proposition if and only if one has a true belief that proposition. So D2 says that having a true belief that P, which is a proposition, is sufficient for one's knowing that proposition. But this too is clearly mistaken, ladies and gentlemen. So one might have a true belief that is not knowledge. Right. So in this case, we are saying that the belief you must have must be a belief for knowledge. Right. Now, and that's why you say justified true beliefs. Now, true beliefs that are mere lucky guesses or mere hunches or based on wild superstitions are not instances of knowledge. And that's why when you craft out a study, right, you must take time thinking about a proposition that you are going to develop. Otherwise, your proposition may not be valid, right? So that's what we have. Now, suppose, for example, I'm giving you another example. Suppose Bonnie reads her horoscope in the newspaper, and it says that she will soon come into money. Now, Bonnie has no evidence to believe that this is true, but still she believes what her horoscope says. There are many of us who believe actually our horoscopes. Now, later in the day, let's imagine that Bonnie finds $50 in the pocket of her old coat. Bonnie's belief that she would come into money was true, but that was not knowledge. Right? These are some of the accidental things. It was a true belief based on no evidence. There was no evidence. So consider, I can give you another case that we can think about. Consider also Odong. Odong is an extreme pessimist, right? He's always pessimistic about everything more or less in life. So consider Odong an extreme pessimist, right? Every morning he forms the belief that something really bad will happen to him that day, right? So he says, today something bad will happen to me. So every morning he forms this belief. Now, though he has no reason or evidence for it, and the belief is almost always false, right? So nothing, I have that belief, right? Something bad will happen. Odong has that belief because he's a pessimist, right? But fortunately or unfortunately in this case, nothing happens to him, right? So that is not really what we are talking about here. That is not knowledge, right? But let's imagine that one afternoon, Odong is hit by a bus, right, and is killed. Now, on that morning, Odong's belief that something really bad would happen to him turned out to be true. But it is false that Odong knew that something really bad was going to happen to him. So there is that element of falsity. So there must be evidence. So his belief, though true, was not an instance of knowledge, ladies and gentlemen. So since D2 takes mere true belief to be sufficient for knowledge, it implies incorrectly that Bonnie and Odong have knowledge. Now, if mere true beliefs is not sufficient for knowledge, then what else is needed, ladies and gentlemen? So one traditional answer is that S knows that P only if P is epistemically justified. For S or P, right, is reasonable for S to believe. Now, in this case, we go to D3, right? We formulate D3, and I'm sure you can see that on the screen here, right? We may formulate this traditional account this way. D3, S knows that P, right? And P is a proposition. In this case, that proposition is equal to DF. So S knows that P, right? Like the other fellow, Odong, who had that thinking in his mind that today something bad will happen, right? Or the other fellow says, today I will get money. So D3, S knows that proposition, I will get money. D3, S knows that, right, that fellow will get an accident that day, right? So this is now the third account that we are talking about, right? D3, S knows that proposition. So let's imagine that these three conditions do exist. S believes that P. So there's that belief, right? Then number two, P is true, right? And then 3, P is epistemically justified for us. So in other words, there is justification, right? In other words, you have evidence. So according to D3, knowledge requires epistemically justified true belief. So let's say that D3 represents a JTB, that's really an abbreviation for justified true belief, right? Account of knowledge. Now, as we have seen, D2, I hope you remember our D2, implies incorrectly that Bonnie knows that she will come into money, and Odong knows that something really bad will happen to him. So they know incorrectly, right? But D3 need not be taken to have that flow, ladies and gentlemen. To see why, consider Bonnie again. She believes that she will come into money. She believes this because she read in the newspapers horoscope, and she has no other evidence for believing it. Now, under these circumstances, the proposition that she will come into money is not one that is justified or reasonable for her. Bonnie's belief does not meet the justification condition in D3 in this case. So D3 does not imply that Bonnie knows. Similar considerations apply to Odong's case. The proposition that something really bad will happen to him today is not justified or reasonable for him to believe. So he simply accepts it on the basis of unexaggerated pessimism. So D3 in this case does not imply that Bonnie knows, right? And that's very important for us. So, or Odong knows anything. So D3 comes in this respect to be an advance over D2, right? So D3 seems to be on the right track, right? In subsequent lectures, ladies and gentlemen, we shall consider some serious objections to D3 and the need to add yet further considerations. But as of now, almost all philosophers agree that D3 is not really adequate as it stands, but they many agree that knowledge does not require, knowledge does require epistemically justified true beliefs. So these things must be there. So even D3 is not really sufficient, but for the time being, it fulfills that situation or that condition of justified true belief, ladies and gentlemen. So allow me now to go into beliefs briefly. And I know that these are issues we have discussed over and over, but we need to really understand beliefs. So whenever we consider a proposition, there are 3 different attitudes we can we can really take towards it. First, we can believe it or accept it as true. Second, we can disbelieve it. That is, believe that it is false or believe its negation. And thirdly, we can withhold belief in it or suspend judgment in this case. So we may illustrate these attitudes by reflecting on the attitudes of different groupings like the theist, the atheist, and the agnostic. Especially they have beliefs, certain beliefs about God. So atheists, the theists have beliefs toward the proposition that God exists. The atheists also have a proposition towards the existence of God, and the agnostics also have an attitude towards the proposition that God exists. Now, in this case, the theist accepts the proposition, right? When you say, if you have that proposition P, God exists, the theist accepts the proposition. The atheist, right, disbelieves it, right? They disbelieve the proposition that God exists. The agnostics withholds belief in that proposition that God exists. So, as we noted earlier, we may think of belief as a propositional attitude. We may think of belief as a relation between a subject and a proposition. There are, of course, many propositional attitudes in addition to belief. For example, hope, fear, doubt, and desire are just some ways in which one may be related to a proposition. Consider the following proposition. It will rain, right? In addition to disbelieving, right? Of course, you can have now different beliefs about this. If you take an example of the theist, and the agnostics, right? If you say, if the proposition is, it will rain, the theist, right, as we saw earlier on, ladies and gentlemen, right, will accept the proposition that it will rain. The atheist or atheist will disbelieve the proposition that it will rain. The agnostic, in this case, will withhold the belief, ladies and gentlemen. So, when we talk about rain that will rain, in addition to believing that it will rain, one can hope, right? One can fear, one can doubt, right? And one can also desire that it rains. So believing a proposition, ladies and gentlemen, needs to be distinguished from other propositional attitudes, such as entertaining and considering a proposition. Now, to entertain a proposition is merely to hold it before the mind. And that's why we entertain a proposition. We merely hold it before the mind. To consider a proposition is to entertain it and to study that proposition and to examine the proposition. Now, one can entertain or consider a proposition without believing it. I can now, for example, entertain and consider the proposition that the earth is a cube without believing it. So I can entertain that proposition, right? And of course, that is entertaining, but I may not actually believe that the earth is a cube. Right, so one can also believe something without entertaining or considering it. So if I tell you that, for example, this morning, I believe that the earth was round, right? Yes, I believe the earth was round, but I did not entertain or consider that proposition. So we all believe a great many things that we are not entertaining or considering. Now, these beliefs are said to be dispositional beliefs, ladies and gentlemen. So my belief this morning that the earth is round was a dispositional belief. So when we believe some proposition that we are entertaining, then our belief is said to be an occurrent belief, right? So when you believe a proposition and you entertain a proposition, then our belief is said to be an occurrent belief. Don't forget that. So, but of course, if you believe certain things, right, but you do not entertain those things, then your belief is said to be dispositional, right? You believe, right, but you are not entertaining, right? Like that example I gave you about the earth is round, right? I, in the morning probably thought the earth is round, and I believe that, but I did not entertain that kind of thing. That is dispositional. But the moment you start entertaining, that's what we call occurrent belief, ladies and gentlemen. Now, since I am not entertaining the proposition that the earth is round, my belief that the earth is round is an occurrent belief. So having a dispositional belief needs to be distinguished from a disposition to believe something, ladies and gentlemen. Now, in the interest of time, ladies and gentlemen, I think I will not really take this concept of belief very, very, very far, but I want you to continue really interrogating this issue of belief, right? And do not forget that the element of, the element that makes knowledge, right, is the one that has the JTB, justified true beliefs. So in other words, there must be that element. So we may say that knowledge requires either occurrent or dispositional belief in this case. So, and that is really very, very important. And the other thing that we probably need to note about beliefs before I leave that point is that belief ranges in terms of intensity or strength from complete, right, and firm conviction. You can have complete and firm conviction, right, but you can also move to another level. You can talk about levels, right, where you can move complete and firm to tentative and cautious acceptance, ladies and gentlemen. So one might be firmly and strongly convinced that God exists, or one might accept it with some weaker degree of conviction. Now, if knowledge requires belief, and belief comes in varying degrees of intensity, ladies and gentlemen, we need to ask ourselves a question. Is there some degree of intensity of belief that is required for knowledge, right? And according to the traditional view, knowledge simply requires justified true belief. Now, as long as one believes that P, right, that proposition, as long as one believes that proposition and other conditions are met, then one knows that proposition, whatever the intensity of one's belief, ladies and gentlemen. So let's move to truth, and I'm going to introduce truth because that's what we are going to discuss in our next lecture, which is lecture 17. Truth is very important. There are many theories about the nature of truth and about what makes a proposition true, right? That's why we talk about true or false, right? A situation that brings out this element of truth. But since in the definition we have knowledge as justified true belief, we can also look at epistemic justifications. I mean, justified true beliefs. First of all, you've got a proposition, right? Of course, at the end of the day, proposition must be true, but we must have justifications. Epistemic justification is important. So according to the traditional justified true belief account, knowledge that proposition P, we know we've been stating this, requires that one be epistemically justified in believing that proposition. And indeed, much of recent epistemology has focused on this topic. And for the moment, we may make the following general points. First, the kind of justification knowledge required is epistemic justification. We must note that there are kinds of justifications that are not epistemic in this case. But we are concerned with epistemic justification, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, we need to really consider, let me just give you an example to bring this to the fore. For example, if the batter who steps out to the plate might be more likely to get a hit if he believes that he will. Of course, he will probably not get a hit, but even for the best batters, the odds of doing so are poor. So still believing that he will succeed and having a positive attitude will help him. So we may grant that he has a practical justification for his belief, even if he has no epistemic justification for it. So you can have that practical, but epistemic justification is important. Again, consider someone facing a life-threatening ailment. So the fellow is actually sick and is facing a life-threatening illness in this case. So, if this ailment that the fellow is suffering from is a kind from which most people do not recover, even though the evidence is against his recovery, a belief that one will recover might improve one's chances. So in such a case, one might have a moral or prudential justification for believing that proposition, right, or that one will recover even if one has no epistemic justification for it. So unlike prudential or moral justification, ladies and gentlemen, epistemic justification seems to be tied in an important way to truth. So there must be an element of truth, though it is hard to say in exactly what way it is connected with the truth, but it must have that element of truth. Perhaps we might say that epistemic justification aims at truth in a way that prudential and moral justifications do not. Perhaps we might say that if one is epistemically justified in believing a proposition, that one's belief is likely to be true, and of course, at the end of the day, that will happen anyway. As we shall see, philosophers differ about the connection between truth and epistemic justification. And in any case, our focus will be on epistemic justification, as I've already said. So hence, when I refer to justification, many times I'll be referring to epistemic justifications. So let's just take a second proposition, a proposition that is very important in this case, that we can use to really bring out the issue of justification. Consider the proposition, right? 1, the number of stars is even, and 2, the number of stars is not even. Right. Remember, we are going to develop propositions, we are going to develop hypotheses, we are going to develop research questions. Right. So if you develop a proposition of this nature, the number of stars is even, and the number of stars is not even. Of course, as you can see, one is null, right? But not in the real sense of a hypothesis, and the other one is alternate, right? Now, clearly, neither 1 nor 2. You see, 1 was the number of stars is even, 2, the number of stars is not even. Clearly, in this case, neither 1 nor 2 is justified for us. So we do not have that justification to put forward that is actually even or not even. So we have no evidence for either. So a proposition can be true without being justified for us. Again, the proposition that there is life on Mars might be true, but as of now, given the state of our evidence, it is not something that we are justified in believing, right? So they just say, yes, there is life on Mars, yes, but we do not know. We don't have evidence to prove. So with respect to these propositions, ladies and gentlemen, we might say that one is not justified in believing them. Instead, one is justified in withholding belief in them. So third, a proposition can be justified and not true, right? So you may have evidence, but unfortunately it's not true. One can be justified in believing a proposition that is false. Suppose, for example, you are justified in believing that it is noon, right? So you believe that it is noon. You are justified because you have just looked at your watch around midday, and it probably says it is noon or about noon. So you might say, yes, it is noon now. You are justified because you have evidence. You have actually read, right? You have looked at the watch, and you have taken the reading in this case. So, but that's what it is. But suppose that unknown to you, your watch stopped working at noon, and it is now around 12:30. So if you simply say that I believe it is noon, that may not be correct. So given your evidence in this case, your belief is justified but false, because your watch stopped working around midday and now it is 12:30 or it's around 1. Again, I might be justified in believing that the person I see going to the library is, for example, Lisa. I am justified because the person I see looks, right, like Lisa. The person I see dresses like Lisa, and the person I see actually behaves just like Lisa. But suppose that unknown to me again, Lisa has an identical twin, and the person I see is not Lisa, but her twin. My belief that the person I saw was Lisa is false, but justified, ladies and gentlemen. So that's the third condition that is important, and we've said a proposition can be justified and not true. So we need to be very careful. Fourth, we need to distinguish a proposition being justified for a person from justifying it, right? You know, we are talking about justified, right? But here we're also introducing another aspect, a person justifying it. So we need to distinguish a proposition's being justified for a person, right, from justifying it. Now, justifying a proposition is an activity that one engages in often when one's belief is challenged, right? So if you say, I see red, another says, no, I see orange, another says, I see purple, right? So your proposition is now challenged. So in other words, you must try to justify. So when you try to justify, you are justifying your proposition in that case. But your proposition may not be justified in this case. So typically when justifying a proposition, one attempts to adduce reason in support. So you try to provide reasons why you support your proposition. And in contrast, a proposition being justified for a person is a state that one is in. In other words, you have facts in this case. Knowledge that P, which is a proposition, requires that one be justified in believing that proposition, but it does not require that one justify one's belief that proposition. So there are a great number of things that each one of us knows that we have never attempted to justify, and these things are very important. So the fifth issue is that unlike justification, right? Don't forget this. Fifth, unlike truth, justification is relative in the sense that a proposition can be justified for one person, but not for another. So this can happen if one person has evidence that another person lacks. Suppose, for example, that Smith is a thief. The proposition that Smith is a thief might be justified for Smith, right, but not justified for anyone else. The reason why it is justified by Smith is that Smith knows himself very well, and he knows whether he has actually been stealing. He knows whether he's a thief or not. So it is justified for Smith, but not justified for us because we don't know unless we adduce sufficient evidence. So Smith could have a lot of evidence that he's a thief, though no one else has. Indeed, many of Smith's friends, as his friend, we may assume or suppose that we only believe he's a thief, but we don't have sufficient evidence. So that is very important for us to think about. So here again, we would have an example of a belief that is justified yet false. So furthermore, a proposition can be justified for a person at one time, but not at another time. So after Smith is caught, tried, and convicted, his friends who have followed the trial closely are highly justified in believing that he's a thief because the court has pronounced itself on this case. So they now have evidence that they did not have before. So justification then can vary from one person to another person, and can also vary from one time to another time, for one person from time to time, depending upon the evidence that he has. Now, the sixth aspect, which is important, is that epistemic justification comes in degrees. So it ranges from propositions that are certain or maximally justified for us to propositions that are just barely justified, that are just barely reasonable to accept in this case. So let's take an example, the proposition that 2 is equals to 2, right? 2 equals 2, right? Take another proposition, I think. Another proposition, I exist, right? So now these ones are certain for me, right? I think, right? That is certain. I exist is certain for me, right? Even 2 is equals to 2 is certain. So these are propositions that are certain. I think, right? So in contrast, the proposition that I will be alive in 3 months is one that is not certain or maximally justified for me, right? Proposition that I will be alive in 3 months, right? It is not certain or maximally justified. And that's why you need more information, and that's why you're talking about justified true beliefs. It is not maximally justified because the proposition that I am alive now is more justified for me than it is. I am alive now. Still, I am justified in believing that I will be alive in 3 months because I'm alive now. I am not, right, thinking about the negatives, but it's a proposition. Remember, proposition deals with the facts. I am alive now, right? And if I am alive now, I can assume that something will happen to me in a week's time, using the knowledge that exists today, using the information that I see, using the facts that I have, right? So if knowledge requires justification, then we might ask a question: what degree of justification does knowledge require in this case? Strictly speaking, our example of D3 does not tell us a number of things. So it seems reasonable to believe that, believe that not just any level of justification will do in this case. So the proposition that I will be alive in 10 years has some degree of justification for me, but it is not high enough for me to know it. I don't know. So similarly, if I know that 60 out of 100 marbles in an urn are black, then the proposition that I will draw a black marble has some positive justification for me, but I am not sufficiently justified to know that I will, because we may pick something that is different, and that's why we use probabilities in this case. So should we say then, ladies and gentlemen, that knowledge, that P is a proposition, requires that one be certain that P, so you should be certain about that proposition. Now that knowledge, right, requires maximum justification. Do we need that maximum justification? I think most philosophers who have defended a justified true belief account would say that knowledge does not require certainty, ladies and gentlemen. They would hold reasonable that we do know, for example, that something, right, happened. Let me just give you an example. If you say Washington was the first president of the United States, right? So those philosophers would hold reasonably that we do know, for example, Washington was the first president of the United States, right? That Mugabe was deposed in a military coup, and many other similar things. But these propositions are not certain for us. They are not as justified for us as 2 equals 2, or I exist. I think it is fair to say that most defenders of the justified true belief account would say that while knowledge does not require certainty, it does require a high degree of justification. So finally, ladies and gentlemen, a proposition can be epistemically justified for a person even if he does not believe it. Consider the confident butter that the example that I used a few minutes ago, right? Confident butter who steps into the butter's box. Again, more often than not, even the best butters fail to get a hit, right? You know that very well. But the proposition that he won't get a hit is epistemically justified for him. But though the proposition is justified for him, he does not believe it. Indeed, he believes its negation. So similarly, the proposition that nothing terrible will happen to him today is justified for pessimistic Odong. I hope you remember that example that I gave you, right? Odong, who is very pessimistic and says, well, something bad will happen to me today, right? But he fails to believe it, right? So some philosophers draw a distinction between a proposition being justified for a person and the propositions being well-founded for a person. So the element of having a well-founded proposition here is very important. So to say that a proposition P is well-founded for a person S is to say that P is justified for S, and that S believes that proposition, which is P, on the basis of his evidence for P, right? P is the evidence. So justified true belief. So if a proposition is well-founded for a person, then he believes it, and he believes it on the basis of evidence, and he supports it in this case. So if a proposition P is well-founded for a person, then he not only has good reasons for believing it, ladies and gentlemen, he only believes it on the basis of good reason. And reason is one of those most philosophical aspects upon which philosophy is founded, ladies and gentlemen. So in such a case, we may also say that his belief, right, that proposition that I've already given you in form of an example, that proposition P is well-founded, or that he justifiably believes that proposition. So to illustrate, let me just give you a simple illustration. I know you can easily get confused. To illustrate the distinction between a proposition being justified and its being well-founded, suppose that Jones is suffering from a serious illness, right? And though the illness is quite serious, like now we are talking about COVID, right? He might be suffering from COVID or something else. But let's imagine something else, right? So Jones is suffering from a serious illness. Though the illness is quite serious in this case, he has excellent evidence that he will fully recover. His doctor, an expert in the field, tells him that there are highly effective treatments for his condition, and that the recovery rate is over 99%. And that is really a medical expert saying that. John also reads the same information about the effectiveness of treatment in a well-respected medical journal. So under these circumstances, we can, or we may assume that the proposition that he will recover is justified for Jones. So he can actually hold a justified true belief. Suppose, however, that Jones does not believe that he will recover on the basis of this evidence. Instead, he believes that he will recover on the basis of some very bad reason. Then, of course, we have a different scenario together. Suppose he believes that he will recover because, right, and this is another example we are giving, but related to the same, because maybe the witch doctor has told him that he will recover, or probably his tea leaf reader said that he would, or he believes he will recover simply on the basis of wishful thinking. Then the point is that even though Jones has excellent reason for believing that he will recover, his belief is not based on those reasons, ladies and gentlemen. So Jones' belief that he will recover is not well-founded in that case. If John's belief that he will recover is not based on the evidence that he has for his proposition, but is based instead on wishful thinking, or the testimony of his tea leaf reader, or probably witch doctor in this case, then it seems plausible to think that John's belief is not an instance of knowledge. So, ladies and gentlemen, I really want to come to the close because of time. Time is not on our side, but as we close, let me give you another proposition. I want to close with a proposition. I hope you not get confused. And that's where we shall start. We know we are dealing with the proposition, and we are dealing with proposition knowledge. So we might, ladies and gentlemen, let's take an example. Of course, I've just given an example of John's. Let's take another proposition, right? So which we shall call D3. So let's imagine that our D3, and of course I gave it to you earlier on, right? But you can still see it here on the screen, D3. D3, S knows that P is equal to DF. And of course our P is a proposition. 1, S believes that proposition, right? Like in our case, we said John, right, knows the president. That could be the proposition. So John is S, right? John knows the president. So John believes that proposition. And that proposition is true, right? So John's belief that he knows the president is well-founded. So on this view, S is, in this case John, S is knowing that P, right, that's the proposition, requires not simply that proposition that he knows the president be justified for S. It also requires that John, who knows the president, believes that proposition, right, that is the knowing of the president, on the basis of evidence, right, that supports that proposition. And such views, or view in this case, will seem plausible, ladies and gentlemen. So, ladies and gentlemen, just in closing, right, I want to thank you for having taken time to come and attend this lecture. I know this lecture has taken some good time, but our major objective was to discuss the issue of truth, which is the central problem of philosophy. And this was just an introductory lecture to the element of truth. So we shall continue discussing the same issue in lecture 17 and lecture 18. But this lecture 16 has centered mainly on knowledge, truth, and justification. And I've given you the introduction. I've given you the three senses of knows. The knows here is K-N-O-W-S. Put that in brackets. Three senses of knows, K-N-O-W-S. Propositional knowledge and justified true belief. We have also looked at the belief and truth well, sketchily, but we've taken some time again discussing epistemic justification, so it becomes very important. Thank you very much. Join us in our next lecture, lecture 17, and lecture 17 will be quite interesting for us because we shall be able now to dig deep into issues of truth, and the aspects that we shall cover in this case, ladies and gentlemen, will deal with the central problem of philosophy of truth, but now discussing the truth lost, right? And I just want to invite you to our lecture 17, but stay well, stay safe, enjoy your day, bye.